2 coolers landed on my counter this morning. Same beat-up corners, same off-white shell, gone gray at the edges. Same little bear-proof certification sticker peeling off the lid. Pop them open, and the foam inside is the exact same dirty cream color, packed the exact same way. Stand 3 feet back, and you could not tell me which is which. One of them, I'll write the customer a ticket for $200. Cash. Today. The other one, I won't take off his hands at any price. Not because it's broken. Because the second I hang a tag on it, it's worth nothing, and all I've done is buy myself a piece of landfill to store. Welcome back to Forbidden Lures, where we take the gear, the tackle, and outdoor industry sells you, drag it up onto the counter under a hard light, and tell you what it is actually worth, not what the sticker wants you to believe. Today, it's the cooler that kicked off a price war. The $100 Ozark Trail off the shelf at Walmart, and the $350 Yeti Tundra it was built to look exactly like. Same science. Same sticker on the lid. Roughly 2.5 times the price. So here's the question the industry would rather you never say out loud at the boat ramp. Is that extra $200+ real engineering, keeping your catch alive on a 100-degree day? Or is it just paper? I've had thousands of both brands cross this counter. Let me show you exactly what I see when they do. Sectian 1. THE SAME FACTORY LIE and THE Nobel-Prize Nobody Mentians. Every other guy who leans on this counter tells me the same rumor. They're the same cooler, man. Same factory. They just swapped the sticker. I let him finish. Then I give it to him straight. It is not the same factory, and it is not the same cooler. But the part nobody wants to hear is why that barely moves the needle on what you should pay. Walmart's Ozark Trail is a house brand. Walmart doesn't own a cooler plant. They rent one. The hard coolers are built by a contract molder called California Innovations, the same outfit behind a stack of other store shelf brands, made overseas in high volume to drive the cost into the floor. Yeti, meanwhile, wants you picturing a Texas workshop. The honest answer is a mix. By Yeti's own word, the Tundra is built in the USA, in Iowa and Wisconsin, and also in the Philippines, while the broader lineup spans China, Vietnam, Taiwan, Malaysia, even Italy. Grab one off the shelf and you won't know which country built yours until you read the tag. Now here's the part the price tag is praying you never learn. Both of these coolers are built from the exact same 2 materials. And both of those materials were handed to us, for free, by chemists who won the Nobel-Prize. Start with the hard shell. Picture a clump of tangled, cooked spaghetti versus a fistful of dry, straight spaghetti standing up in the box. Old plastic was the tangled, branched clump, soft, weak, useless for a cooler. Then, in 1951, 2 Phillips petroleum chemists named Robert Banks and J. Paul Hogan worked out how to grow the molecule long, straight, and packed tight. And a German chemist, Carl Ziegler, cracked the same thing independently right behind them. Ziegler would go on to share the 1963 Nobel Prize in Chemistry with Italy's Giulio Natta for exactly that work. What they invented is high-density polyethylene, HDPE, straight, dense, lined-up molecules. And that structure is the only reason a thin plastic shell can shrug off a drop off the tailgate. Every rotomolded cooler on Earth is built from it. Then, the cold-keeping part. They take a powder of that HDPE, pour it into a steel mold, and spin it slowly in an oven until it melts into one seamless skin, like coating the inside of a hollow chocolate Easter bunny. Then they shoot an expanding foam into the gap between the walls, the way spray foam stiffens a surfboard or seals an attic, and it hardens into a solid, cold-blocking layer. And that foam exists because of one German chemist, Otto Bayer, whose team back in 1937 figured out that you could mix 2 liquids together and get a rigid foam out the other side. Polyurethane. A recipe nearly 90 years old, so sit with that. The shell is Nobel-grade chemistry from the 1950s. The foam is a recipe from 1937. The molding is the same process they use for whitewater kayaks in the trash cart at the end of your driveway. Nobody owns any of it. Walmart can rent the exact same chemistry and the exact same oven Yeti uses. So if the science is free and nearly a century old, where is your $200 actually going? To answer that, you go back to one man who got rich selling somebody else's coolers, years before he ever built one of his own. Section 2. Distributor WHO Beweilt AN Empire ONA markup. Before Yeti was a brand on the back of every other pickup in America, it was two brothers out of the Texas Hill Country, Roy and Ryan Siders. And here's the chapter their polished origin video glides right past. Roy did not invent the rugged cooler. From 2003 to 2006, he made his living as a distributor, selling another company's imported Rotomolded coolers here in the States. He shipped someone else's product. He watched the money roll in, and he noticed two things that would make him a fortune. Those coolers had design flaws he knew he could fix, and people were willing to pay shocking money for a box that simply refused to break. So in 2006, the brothers struck out on their own. They partnered with a factory in the Philippines, and in 2008 they put their Tundra on the market for $250 to $300, roughly 10 times what a normal cooler cost back then. 10 times. For a cooler. Everybody told them they were out of their minds. But it was no random gamble. Their father, Roger Siders, was a high school shop teacher who'd invented FlexCoat. The rod-wrapping finish a whole lot of you have brushed over the guides on your own builds. These were tackle people, down in the bone. They understood the one thing the discount brands never did. A serious angler will pay almost anything for gear that won't quit on him out on the water. And the second it worked, Yeti slammed the door shut behind them. They sued RT, and in early 2017, RT settled, agreeing to stop selling the copies, redesign everything in question, and cut Yeti a check. They went after Mammoth. They went after Axis and Bayou iceboxes. So understand precisely what that price tag is buying you. Part of your $350 is the lawyers who make dead certain nobody can legally sell you the same shape for less. The man built an empire distributing another company's cooler, then spent a fortune making sure no one could ever do to him what he had quietly done first. From where I sit, that's not an insult. It's the whole business, played perfectly. But it's the first honest answer to where your money goes, and it does not all go into the foam. Speaking of the foam, they want you dead certain that's where the value hides. The cold holding. So let's put both of these in the heat and settle it, because that number printed proudly on the box, that's the one they're praying you'll trust. Section 3. VHE, number ON, THE box, ISA Megask trick. Yeti's spec sheet claims up to 3 inches of what they've branded permafrost insulation. Ozark's box claims it holds ice for more than 7 days. Both of those are the company's own number. Neither one is a referee's number. So I quit trusting the box a long time ago, and I started reading the independent tests instead. Here's what those head-to-heads actually show, and it's not what either marketing department wants printed. Independent testers, outfits like Wirecutter, plus a stack of real-world field tests keep landing on the same unglamorous answer. In controlled conditions, the Yeti usually wins. By about a day, maybe 2. That's the whole gap. And in plenty of field tests, the cheap Ozark didn't just keep up. It flat out beat Yetis that cost 3 times as much, still holding solid ice on day 6 while the famous brand was swimming in melt. Days of ice does not cleanly separate these two. Anybody who tells you the Yeti holds ice twice as long is selling you something, and it isn't a cooler. But here's the thing. Days of ice was always the wrong number to be staring at. Think of it like a stone wall versus a cardboard wall on a brutal afternoon. Both keep the sun off you for a while. The real difference shows up afterward. The stone wall stays cool to the touch long after the cardboard's gone warm and useless because it holds that cold inside its own mass. That's thermal inertia. And for you, the angler, that's the only number that actually matters. Because here's the reality of a real fishing trip. Your ice turns to water. It always does, usually by the second day. And the moment it does, the only question left is how cold that water stays. Because that meltwater is what's sitting against your fillets, soaking your live bait, chilling your cut shad in the bottom of the box. And this is where the better-built cooler quietly earns a piece of its keep. In side-by-side tests, the cheap box goes warm in a hurry once the solid ice is gone, while the denser, better-sealed one holds that ice water near freezing noticeably longer. That edge comes down to one thing: more of Otto Bayer's polyurethane, packed in tighter, behind a better lid seal. I won't slap a fake hour count on it the way the clickbait channels do, because the tests genuinely disagree on the exact numbers. But the pattern is real and repeatable. Thermal mass keeps your catch firm after the ice has melted out from under it. And the box never advertises that, because you can't print it as a number that sounds as sexy as 10 days. So watch the trick. The spec they shout at you, days of ice, is the one that barely predicts whether your catch survives and barely separates the brands. And the spec that actually keeps your fish from going to mush, they don't print at all. The loudest number on the box is the one that matters the least. Now, cold holding is where the marketing lives. But value? Real value lives in what breaks, and in what happens to you when it does. That's where I make my money. And that's where the gap between these two finally gets honest. Quick one before we get to the failures. Everything I'm walking you through here, the resale math, the failure points that quietly tank a cooler's value, the exact things I check before I'll write anybody a ticket. I put it all on a single-page cooler resale and failure audit, and you can download it free. Links in the description. Print it, laminate it, throw it in the truck. Next time you're standing in front of a wall of 40 coolers, you run the sheet instead of running the sticker price. All right, back to the counter. Sectine 4. Watch at Breeks, and WAI, want BUA IT broken. When a cooler hits my counter, I am not admiring it. I am hunting for the thing that's going to fail, because that thing is what sets my price. So let me tell you what I actually find. The Ozark's documented soft spot is the drain. Owners and reviewers report that spout leaking on and off and sweating condensation around the plug, so you set it in the bed of your truck full of melt and fish water and come back to a puddle in your carpet. Credit where it's due, and I'm always fair on price. That plug is leashed on a little chain, so you won't lose it down the lake. It's the seal that's the gamble, not the cap. And here's where I have to correct something the internet repeats constantly. People love to say Ozark gives you no warranty, no support, nothing. Just toss it when it breaks. That is flat out false. Ozark coolers ship with a limited warranty. Depending on the model and the year it was made, that's anywhere from 1 to 5 years. So that is not the real difference between these two. The real difference is parts. Yeti pioneered those rubber T-handle latches and a freezer-grade gasket. But the bigger thing is that Yeti will sell you a replacement latch, gasket, or drain plug and walk you through swapping it at the kitchen table. A Yeti stays in service for 15 years because you can keep feeding it parts. Go try to source a latch for a discontinued Ozark and you'll burn a Saturday on the phone chasing a part that may not exist anymore. So watch how this hits my ticket. I don't dock the Ozark because it fails more often. Honestly, used hard, those things are tougher than people give them credit for. I dock it because when it does fail, I can't fix it. And a broken cooler I can't part out is worth exactly 0 to me. A broken Yeti is still worth money on this counter because the parts exist and somebody out there will rebuild it. That's what durability actually means in my line of work. Not whether it survives a drop off the tailgate, but whether you can keep it alive after it doesn't. And before the Yeti diehards get too comfortable up here, your $300 cooler has a dumb flaw of its own. Tip a Tundra onto its side, or flip it upside down in a rolling boat, and it'll leak water right out the seam. Those latches pull the lid down hard, but they were never built to seal against a rollover. Nobody up on this counter is perfect, not even at $350. There's one more sticker on both of these lids I still haven't dealt with, that Bear certification. And that one comes with a line of fine print that quietly makes the whole $200 gap disappear. Sectine 5. DHE beer sticker and DHE fine print. Both of these coolers are certified bear resistant by the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee. That's the real federal program. Live grizzlies, the whole rigorous test. And you'll hear people swear the cheap Ozark doesn't carry that certification. They're wrong. The $100 Ozark passed the same bear test as the $350 Yeti. If you camp near bear country, that sticker means something. But you have to read the fine print the committee itself prints, because this is exactly the kind of thing that gets your food eaten and your trip ruined. A certified cooler is only bear resistant if it's locked. Padlocks or bolts run through the corner plates. An unlocked cooler, any brand, any price, is not bear resistant. It's a snack box with a logo on it. So here's the buried truth on the whole bear question. Against a 600-pound grizzly, your $100 Ozark with 2 cheap padlocks through the corners beats your $350 Yeti sitting there wide open. The certification is identical. The padlock is what saves your bacon, not the price and not the brand on the side. The bear cannot read a logo. Which brings us, at last, to my counter. To the one number in this entire fight that nobody can fake. The number that tells you the whole truth about that $200 gap. The resale ticket. Section 6. DHE resale ticket. DHE only honest number. This is what I do for a living, so lean in, because this is the part the whole price tag argument always conveniently leaves out. A new sticker price is a story. A story a marketing department wrote to separate you from your money. The resale ticket is the one number nobody can fake. Not Yeti. Not Walmart. Not the YouTuber holding the thing up to a camera. A used Yeti Tundra. Scuffed, scratched, run hard for years. Still resells for roughly 60 to 70% of what it cost brand new. 60 to 70%. And here's the detail that ought to stop you cold. Yeti runs its own official used gear store. They buy back and resell their own scratched and dented coolers, sorted into condition tiers, right there on their own website. Think about that. The manufacturer makes a market in its own second-hand product. That is not a cooler company. That's a company that turned a plastic box into something that holds its value like a good tool, like a firearm, like a clean used outboard motor. Now the Ozark. The day you walk it out the doors of Walmart, it is a consumable. It depreciates straight toward nothing. No collector demand, no parts, no buyback program, no line of guys waiting around for a used one. On my counter, it's a no ticket. And I want to be clear. That's not because it's a bad cooler. It's because the market has no memory of it. And here is the math that flips this entire video on its head. Everybody lines up a $100 Ozark against a $350 Yeti and says, well, the Yeti costs $250 more. Wrong. Run it like an appraiser runs it. That Yeti, you can resell for $200+ after years of abuse. So your true cost of owning it was maybe $150. That Ozark, you can't resell at all, so it cost you every single dollar you paid for it. All of a sudden, that $200 gap isn't $200. It might be $50. Sometimes the expensive cooler is the cheap one to own. And the discount brands are praying with everything they've got that you never sit down and run that number. That, right there, is the secret the whole industry is built on. They sell you the sticker price, loud and proud, and they bury the resale ticket, because the resale ticket is the only number that tells you the truth about whether you bought a tool or you bought trash. So, after all of it, the factory, the founder, the foam, the failures, the ledger. Which one do I actually tell you to put on your boat? That depends entirely on who you really are. DHE verdict. Nahashich Kohler AREU? If you're a weekend guy, Saturday morning on the local pond, tailgate with the boys, 2 or 3 nights of camping a year, kids running in and out of that lid every 20 minutes for a soda. You buy the Ozark and you don't think twice about it. And here's the appraiser's reason most channels will never give you. Every single time you crack that lid, you dump the cold and let a wave of warm air pour right in. open it constantly, all day long, and you neutralize the one real advantage the expensive cooler ever had. You'd be paying $350 for thermal performance you are literally venting straight up into the sky. Take the $100 box, take the $200 you just saved, and put it into a rod and reel that'll actually help you feel the bite. But if you're a guide whose livelihood rides on the gear holding up, or you're going a week deep into the backcountry where a failure is the line between fresh fish and a box full of ruin, or you simply want to own something that resells like an asset instead of dying as garbage, then the Yeti earns every penny of that $350. You're buying parts you can replace for 15 years. You're buying meltwater that stays cold against your catch long after the ice is gone. And you're buying a resale ticket that I will actually honor when you drag it up onto this counter someday. That is not a logo. That is paper in the bank. So here's the last thing, and then I'll let you go. The price tag is a story somebody wrote to get into your wallet. The resale ticket is the one number on this whole planet that nobody can fake. The industry sells you the first and buries the second. And now, finally, you can read both of them. So walk into that store knowing exactly which cooler you are. If this is the kind of thing you're after, gear stripped all the way down to what it's truly worth instead of what the box claims, subscribe and stick around. We drag something new up onto the counter every week. And I want to hear from you. Are you an Ozark Trail value guy through and through, or a die-hard Yeti owner who'll never go back? Tell me down in the comments what's held up for you and what's let you down. I read every one of them. Until next time, know what it's worth before you ever pay for it. Keep your lines tight and keep that catch cold. I'll see you back at the counter.